Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material where I attempt to answer questions sent in by readers, listeners, and viewers. You can, of course, ask a question. You can send us an email, a postcard. You can comment on a previous video or podcast, and we'll get it. And I will attempt to answer it. This happens weekly, so you can go back. I think we're well over a couple of hundred of these now. You can, of course, watch the big podcast, the Ancient Warfare podcast, which comes out every month. And you can even watch the Ancient History podcast. You can back us on Patreon/Ancient Warfare podcast and back us at one of three levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion, $1, $5, and $10. Okay. Today's question comes from Dylan. Hi, Murray. I have a question for you to answer on Ancient Warfare Answers. Well, here we are. In more modern battles, such as Waterloo, we see that small farm compounds like Haye Sainte and Hougoumont, which are much smaller than a village or a town, play a big role in the fighting and how that battle turns out. A battlefield spanning a few kilometres wide will inevitably have a few of these types of small built-up areas, especially since any nice flat terrain is the perfect place for fields and paddocks for farming. Despite this, we do not seem to see small farms or villas having a big effect in ancient battles. Why do you think this is the case, or do you know of any good examples where a small built-up area played a role on ancient battlefields? Oh, nice. Now, probably there are, and I do have a couple of examples in mind to bring up later. The interesting thing about a lot of the ancient battles, of course, is that the narrative of the battle is about the battlefield, and many battlefields in the ancient world are chosen to be that because they are flat, open plains and not fought in built-up areas. Obviously, there are battles in built-up areas. You look at the battles in Sparta in the 4th century, Epaminondas, and then later into the 3rd century, Pyrrhus of Epirus trying to conquer Sparta. Of course, Pyrrhus of Epirus dies in the streets of Argos in street fighting, and there are other battles of street fighting where obviously they're being fought inside a town, which is ridiculous. The battles at the end of the Peloponnesian War in Athens and the Piraeus, for instance. You know, even some of them in Amphipolis, where the Spartans burst out and defeat the Athenians in 422 BC. So that they do occur. The interesting thing is, I think in many cases, if there is a building, it doesn't play a role in the battle itself. And there are a couple of buildings that do, which are interesting. There are a couple of instances where, for instance, at the end of the Battle of Adrianople, we are told that Valens, having been wounded in the battle by an arrow, takes refuge in a small farmhouse, and it's surrounded by the Goths and burned. And Ammianus tells us that he got the story that Valens was burned to death there by one of the bodyguards jumping from a second-story window and surviving. So, you know, it's like, wow, that's eyewitness testimony that Ammianus supports. So in that sense, that's a massive outcome for a particularly minor building. So yes, they do occur. In a couple of others, you know, Cannae is not a particularly important town to name a battle after. Similarly, you've got the Battle of Gaugamela, which again is not a significant place. And Arrian talks about the naming of that battle not to be Gaugamela because it's such an ugly word in the sound for the Greeks, and it in turn gets named Bela because Arbela is a better sounding word, and B, a more significant town nearby, but it's not where the battle was fought. And so in those senses, you've got the idea of choosing a name for a battle which gives it significance and might ignore the fact that it was fought near a less significant place. You know, even when we think about Marathon is not a particularly significant place at the time that the battle's fought. It becomes that, but it's chosen because it suits the enemy, and therefore the Athenians are sort of forced to fight there, and they make it work for their tactics. But at the same time, it's where the battle is. So, you know, we do have lots of maneuverings and some accounts of battles where armies come out and they, you know, offer themselves for battle and the enemy refuses until, you know, they're starved or changing their formation. You also get battles where a feature is taken advantage of. The Battle of Olpae in 426 BC. There's a ravine where you can hide a force, which Demosthenes does who attack the enemy in the rear when the battle is fought. So in that sense, they're not buildings as such, but they certainly are features that allow it. Even at the Battle of Delium, there's a hill that Pagondas sends his cavalry around. So they're features, but they're not necessarily built up. And those, farmhouses and things get ignored. There's one account, a fabulous account of a very small troop of cavalry in the Belisarius's account Belisarius's campaign to recapture Vandals North Africa, where this small unit of cavalry is surrounded by the Vandals and they break out and escape. And that sense of it's a single farmhouse where they're spending the night. So you do get these accounts. Again, using the Belisarius example, the Battle of Ad Decium at the 10th, presumably there are some buildings around that 10th milestone. And the fact of the matter is that the word used to describe that location doesn't necessarily for us indicate that there was buildings or a farmstead or something there, but there was. And so, there's all sorts of incidents within ancient warfare where buildings and refuges are taken in buildings or used to defend the wall at Thermopylae, for instance, is another one where there is a built-up wall at the very least, which becomes very important in the fighting of the battle. But for the most part, the battle itself is either fought on a field chosen because there isn't anything to interrupt the enemy, the battle lines. The Battle of Gaugamela, the Persians prepare the battlefield specifically for their chariots. And also you've got the idea that if the battle did involve such a thing, often it's been omitted from these accounts, which are sort of not watered down, but they've certainly only chosen to emphasize the features of the battle which make the battle work. And so in a couple of cases, we do get these small buildings mentioned, but in most cases they are ignored because they didn't really play a part in the battle outcome. And so they kind of get ignored. And that's a fascinating part of all of these sorts of things. Ammianus retreating from Nisibis and heading towards Amida, there's talk of an orchard. There's talk of they spend the night in an orchard. So again, there is, and they're being pursued by the enemy at that point in time. So there is these incidents throughout military history, but generally not the big battles, because again, the big battles are associated with a larger picture that doesn't involve a small farmhouse or locale. But again, like your examples of Waterloo and Haye Sainte and Hougoumont, there are some battles where that actually does play a part in the name of the battle itself. So I hope that answers your question, Dylan, and join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.